The apple sitting in your fruit bowl right now was picked between 9 and 12 months ago. It has been sealed in a controlled atmosphere chamber, with oxygen reduced to 1% to suppress its own ripening biology. It has been coated in synthetic wax to replace the natural bloom, stripped during industrial washing. And 98% of conventional apple samples tested by the USDA contained at least one pesticide residue, with an average of more than 4 different chemicals per sample. Medieval apples were medicine. Your store-bought apple is a cosmetic product engineered to look like one, and the difference between those two things is not a matter of preference. It is a matter of chemistry that has been quietly building for 70 years. Before we talk about what was lost, you need to understand what the apple actually is at its biological origin, because the story begins not in an English orchard or a French monastery, but in a mountain range in Central Asia that most people have never heard of. The Tian Shan Mountains of modern-day Kazakhstan, a region of wild forest where a species called Malus sieversii still grows today exactly as it grew millions of years before any human being thought to cultivate it. Malus sieversii is the direct ancestor of every apple you have ever eaten, and it looks nothing like what you buy at the supermarket. The fruits are small, often no larger than a golf ball. They range in colour from pale yellow to deep crimson to almost black. Some are intensely sweet, others are so astringent they make your mouth contract. Many are bitter in ways that modern palates would reject immediately. But that bitterness and astringency are not defects, they are the entire point. Those flavours come from polyphenols, secondary metabolites that the tree produces as its primary defence system against fungal pathogens, insect predation, and oxidative stress from intense high-altitude sunlight. The more hostile the environment, the more polyphenols the tree produces. The more polyphenols in the fruit, the more biologically active the apple is for the animal that eats it. Research comparing wild Malus sieversii to modern cultivated varieties reveals a discrepancy that should be on the front page of every nutrition journal in the world. Wild apples consistently demonstrate higher concentrations of beneficial metabolites, often by more than tenfold. Anthocyanins, the pigments responsible for deep red and purple coloration, are present at concentrations 103 times higher in wild apples than in commercial cultivars. Epicatechins, the polyphenols associated with cardiovascular protection, are present at concentrations nearly 24 times higher. Gallic acid at 30 times higher, vitamin C at twice the concentration. Less than 50 grams of a wild Malus sieversii apple delivers effective doses of several key polyphenols. To get the same dose from a modern commercial Fuji apple, you would need to eat several pounds of fruit. The apple was not always what it is today. What it used to be was something genuinely extraordinary. In the monastery gardens of medieval Europe, the apple was not a snack, it was infrastructure. Benedictine monasteries across France, Germany and England maintained orchards of extraordinary diversity. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, whose 9th century plan is the most complete surviving document of medieval monastic design, shows dedicated apple orchards positioned alongside the infirmary garden where medicinal plants were grown. The proximity was not accidental. The apple was both food and medicine, and the monks who tended these orchards understood the distinction between varieties with the same precision that a modern pharmacist understands the distinction between drug formulations. By 1000 CE, Cistercian monks were conducting systematic breeding programs, crossing as many as 10,000 seedlings annually. Not for sweetness, not for shelf life, not for the ability to survive a truck journey from Washington state to a Florida supermarket. They were breeding for specific therapeutic properties, for cider fermentation chemistry, for winter storage capability, and for the particular flavour profiles that made each variety suited to a specific use. Charlemagne's Capitular de Villis, issued around 800 CE, mandated the planting of 16 specific apple varieties across 600 royal estates. The document names each variety and specifies its intended use. This was not agricultural policy. It was nutritional infrastructure management at a civilizational scale. Medieval dietetic practice used apples for a range of therapeutic applications, aiding digestion, treating constipation, reducing fever. The skin treatment called pomatum, produced by combining apple pulp with swine's grease and rosewater, was widely used to soften skin and reduce inflammation. The oxalic acid concentrated in apple skin, now recognised by modern pharmacology as a potent anti-inflammatory compound, was doing exactly what medieval physicians observed it doing, without anyone knowing the molecular mechanism. By the 18th century, the Royal Horticultural Society's collection at Chiswick contained over 1,400 distinct cultivars. In France, the Normandy cider apple tradition had developed over 800 varieties specifically adapted to local soil and fermentation chemistry. In North America, open pollination after European settlement produced over 14,000 named apple varieties by the mid-19th century. Today, 6 varieties account for over 90% of all apples sold commercially in the United States. 6, from 14,000 to 6 in less than 200 years. The transition from medieval apple to modern commodity began in earnest in the 19th century, accelerated by the California Gold Rush and the US Homestead Act of 1862, which required settlers to plant 40 apple trees per quarter section. 50 million trees planted across the Great Plains by 1890. The demand for fruit that could survive long-distance transport and appeal to the broadest possible consumer base drove the selection of a handful of varieties that could do both. What followed was the most consequential nutritional trade-off in the history of food. Modern breeding specifically targeted the MA1 locus on chromosome 16 to reduce fruit acidity. The goal was palatability. Consumers, particularly children, preferred sweeter, less tart fruit. Genomic studies have identified clear signatures of selective sweeps at this locus in fresh market apples, confirming that the reduction of malic acid was a primary and deliberate breeding objective. Simultaneously, the LAR1 locus governing the production of epicatechins and procyanidins, the bitter-tasting polyphenols that provide the most potent cardiovascular and metabolic benefits, was selected against. Bitterness was a commercial liability. The compounds that caused it were the most medicinally active substances in the fruit. The result is what pomologists now classify using the Long Ashton Research Station system. Modern fresh market apples are overwhelmingly sweet or subacid. The bittersweet and bitter-sharp categories, which describe apples with high tannin and acid concentrations, have been almost entirely eliminated from commercial production. Those tannins, the procyanidins and catechins that medieval physicians were prescribing, and that modern research confirms as potent inhibitors of carbohydrate digestion, glucose absorption, and inflammatory pathways, are now found primarily in heritage cider varieties that most consumers never encounter. The dilution effect compounds this genetic loss. Modern breeding prioritized yield, size, and water content. The plant's metabolic energy was redirected from the synthesis of complex secondary metabolites toward the accumulation of water and simple sugars. Modern apples contain more water than their historical counterparts. The minerals and vitamins are diluted across a larger volume of fruit. USDA nutritional data tracking from 1950 to 1999 documented significant declines across multiple nutrients in commercially grown produce. Iron fell by 50% in some analyses, copper by 49%, sodium by 52%. The dilution effect is not theoretical, it is measured. It is in the government's own data. Here is where the story moves from nutritional decline to something more immediately concerning. The Environmental Working Group has placed apples on its dirty dozen list of most pesticide-contaminated produce for years running. USDA testing between 2023 and 2024 found that 98% of conventional apple samples contained at least one pesticide residue, with an average of more than 4 different chemicals per sample. The defense offered by industry organizations is that residues are nearly always below EPA tolerance levels. But this defense addresses individual chemical safety in isolation. It does not address the cocktail effect of 4 or more simultaneous chemical exposures, and it does not address the specific chemicals involved. Diphenylamine, known as DPA, is applied post-harvest to 67% of non-organic apples to prevent storage scald, the brown patches that develop during long-term cold storage. DPA is not a pesticide in the conventional sense. It is a preservative for the apple's appearance. In 2012, European regulators declined to approve DPA, citing insufficient safety data regarding the breakdown products it forms during storage. The primary concern is nitrosamine formation. When DPA combines with nitrogen-containing compounds, it can form nitrosamines, compounds classified as probable human carcinogens. The European ban on DPA has effectively blocked conventional Washington state apple exports to the UK and EU, forcing those shipments into less regulated markets. Pyrimethanol, found on 73% of tested samples, has been linked to thyroid disruption during pregnancy in chronic rat exposure studies. Fludioxonil, found on 45% of samples, has been assessed by the European Food Safety Authority as a potential endocrine disruptor, interfering with estrogen, androgen and steroidogenesis pathways. It is also classified as a PFAS pesticide, contributing to persistent environmental contamination. Then there is the wax. After industrial washing strips the apple's natural protective bloom, a synthetic coating is applied to prevent moisture loss during the months of storage. Many commercial waxes contain morpholine as an emulsifier. Morpholine is a nitrosamine precursor. In the presence of dietary nitrites, it can form N-nitrosamorpholine in the stomach. The European Union and United Kingdom have prohibited morpholine in food coatings entirely. The United States has not. The medieval apple had none of this. Pest control in the medieval orchard was limited to manual removal, cider vinegar washes, and the biological diversity of the orchard ecosystem itself, which supported the predatory insects that kept pest populations in check. The modern apple supply chain requires a feat of biological engineering that has no historical precedent. An apple picked in October in Washington state must look, feel, and taste acceptable to a consumer in Florida in July. That is a 9-month gap between harvest and consumption. Controlled atmosphere storage achieves this by placing the fruit in sealed chambers where oxygen is reduced to 1 to 3% and carbon dioxide is elevated. At these concentrations, the apple's own metabolic processes are suppressed. Ethylene production, the hormone that drives ripening, is inhibited. The fruit enters a state of biological stasis. Research on the effect of controlled atmosphere storage on apple phytochemicals confirms what the biology predicts. While CA storage preserves total phenols better than regular cold storage, a general decrease in antioxidant activity is still observed during the 180-day storage period. The apple that reaches you in July is not the apple that was picked in October. It is a chemically quieter version of that apple, with reduced antioxidant activity and altered flavour chemistry. The flavour change is not subtle. The volatile compounds responsible for apple aroma, the esters and aldehydes that give a freshly picked apple its characteristic smell, are produced by the same enzymatic processes that CA storage suppresses. An apple stored for 9 months in controlled atmosphere has lost a significant fraction of its aromatic complexity. The flat, slightly mealy texture and a muted flavour of a supermarket apple in spring is not a variety characteristic. It is the signature of biological stasis. Medieval people ate apples fresh from the tree in autumn, dried and stored through winter, or fermented into cider that preserved the fruit's biological activity in a completely different form. They did not eat apples that had been chemically suspended for 9 months. The concept would have been incomprehensible to them, and the nutritional profile of what they ate reflected that immediacy. It's the dimension of medieval apple culture that modern nutrition has most completely failed to understand. Medieval cider was not a recreational beverage, it was a fermented food with a specific biological function in the diet of communities that had no refrigeration, no pasteurization, and no reliable access to clean water in many seasons. The fermentation of apple juice by wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria transforms the polyphenol profile of the fruit in ways that increase bioavailability. The procyanidins and catechins in the apple, already present at higher concentrations in the bitter-sweet and bitter-sharp varieties used for cider, are partially broken down by fermentation into smaller phenolic compounds that are more readily absorbed by the human gut. The organic acids produced during fermentation, primarily malic acid and lactic acid, create an environment in the gut that favours the growth of beneficial bacteria. Medieval cider was, by modern definition, a probiotic food, not by design, by the inevitable consequence of traditional fermentation practice. The polyphenols in traditional cider apples are known to inhibit carbohydrate digestion and glucose absorption in the intestine, modulate glucose release from the liver, and activate insulin receptors. Without these compounds, the apple's high fructose content is absorbed more rapidly, placing a higher metabolic burden on the liver. The modern Fuji apple, with one of the lowest acid proportions of any commercial variety, at 0.07 grams per 100 milliliters and high glucose levels, delivers its sugar load without the polyphenol breaks that the medieval apple provided. The medieval peasant drinking a cup of bittersweet cider with his meal was not just hydrating. He was consuming a fermented polyphenol concentrate that modulated his blood sugar response to the meal, supported his gut microbiome, and delivered antioxidant compounds at concentrations that no modern commercial apple can match. Apple cider vinegar, the further fermentation of cider by acetic acid bacteria, concentrates these effects further. Medieval households used apple cider vinegar as a preservative, a cleaning agent, a wound treatment, and a digestive aid. The acetic acid it contains has been shown in modern research to reduce postprandial blood glucose by up to 34% when consumed with a high-carbohydrate meal. The medieval physician prescribing apple vinegar for digestive complaints was not practicing superstition. He was practicing applied biochemistry without the vocabulary to describe the mechanism. Nutritional density of the medieval apple was not just a product of the variety, it was a product of the soil that grew it. Medieval orchards were managed within the broader agricultural system of the estate or monastery. Sheep grazed beneath the trees, depositing manure that fed the soil microbiome and replenished trace minerals. Fallen leaves and fruit were composted in place. The orchard floor was a living ecosystem of grasses, herbs, and wildflowers that supported the mycorrhizal fungal networks, connecting the tree roots to mineral reserves in the subsoil. Those mycorrhizal networks are the mechanism by which trees access zinc, iron, copper, and manganese from soil layers that their own roots cannot reach. A tree growing in biologically active soil with intact mycorrhizal networks concentrates minerals in its fruit at rates that a tree growing in chemically managed, biologically depleted soil cannot match. Modern commercial apple orchards are managed with herbicides that eliminate the ground cover beneath the trees, destroying the habitat for the mycorrhizal fungi that would otherwise extend the tree's mineral access. Synthetic fertilizers provide nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but do not replenish the trace minerals that the mycorrhizal network would otherwise supply. The fruit grows large and fast on the macronutrient supply. But the trace mineral concentration, the zinc, the iron, the copper, the manganese that end up in the apple, and ultimately in the person eating it, reflects the biological poverty of the soil that produced it. The dilution effect documented in the USDA data is not just a consequence of breeding for larger fruit. It is a consequence of growing that larger fruit in soil that has been systematically stripped of the biological infrastructure that concentrated minerals in the first place. The evidence assembled here does not mean that eating a modern apple is worse than eating no apple. A commercial Fuji apple is still a better choice than a bag of chips. The chlorogenic acid it contains, even at reduced concentrations, still provides meaningful antioxidant activity. The fibre, though lower than in heritage varieties, still supports gut health. The point is not that the modern apple is poison. The point is that it is a diminished version of something that was once genuinely extraordinary. And the gap between what it was and what it is now is not a natural evolution. It is the consequence of a series of deliberate industrial decisions that prioritized appearance, shelf life, and transport durability over every biological property that made the apple valuable in the first place. The path back is not complicated. It does not require a return to medieval agriculture. Heritage and heirloom apple varieties are available from specialist nurseries. Varieties like Cox's Orange Pippin, Kingston Black, Yarlington Mill, and Foxwhelp, the bittersweet and bitter-sharp cider apples that carry the polyphenol profiles closest to the medieval orchard, can be grown in a standard garden. Farmers' markets in most regions now carry heritage varieties in autumn that have never seen a controlled atmosphere chamber. Organic certification, while imperfect, eliminates the DPA, pyromethanol, fludioxonil, and morpholine wax that coat 98% of conventional apples. The nutritional difference between organic and conventional apples is measurable. A 2012 study found that organic apples had significantly higher antioxidant activity and a more diverse and active microbial community on their skin, the very microbiome that interacts with your gut when you eat the fruit unwashed. And fermentation remains available to anyone with apples and patience. Traditional cider made from heritage varieties, fermented with wild yeasts and consumed young, delivers the polyphenol profile that the medieval diet relied on. Apple cider vinegar, made from the same fruit and used as a daily condiment, provides the acetic acid and phenolic compounds that modulate blood sugar and support digestive function. The knowledge of what the apple used to be has not disappeared. It is in the heritage orchards that survived the consolidation. It is in the cider traditions of Normandy and Somerset and the Basque country. It is in the wild Malus sieversii forests of Kazakhstan, where the genetic reservoir of everything the apple ever was still grows exactly as it always has. The apple did not fail us. We failed the apple. We took a fruit that had spent millions of years evolving a chemical defense system so sophisticated that it could suppress fungal pathogens, modulate human blood sugar, support gut microbiome diversity, and deliver antioxidant compounds at concentrations that no pharmaceutical has matched. And we bred out the bitterness. We stripped the bloom. We sealed it in a chamber for 9 months. We coated it in wax and fungicide. And we called it progress. The medieval peasant eating a small, tart, astringent apple from a tree his grandfather planted was not eating inferior food while waiting for us to invent something better. He was eating a fruit that was doing things in his body that the pale, sweet, chemically preserved object in your fruit bowl cannot do. Not everything that changed with modernization was an improvement. Some things were simply made more convenient, more uniform and more profitable, and the cost of that convenience was paid quietly in the nutritional quality of the most iconic fruit in human history over the course of 70 years, without anyone asking whether the trade was worth making. The apple is still there, the real one, in heritage orchards, in farmers' markets in October, in the wild forests of Kazakhstan where Malus sieversii still produces fruit that contains 100 times the anthocyanins of anything in your supermarket. The question is not whether you can access it. The question is whether you know it exists. Subscribe. Every week we dig up the food history, the nutritional science, and the agricultural knowledge that the industrial food system quietly replaced. Not because the original was inferior, but because it could not be standardized, shipped, and sold at scale. The apple remembers what it used to be. The question is whether we do.